In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on two-dimensional arrays. We'll start by taking a look at some special cases. So the first thing is that Java lets us specify a different number of columns for every single row. So in the last lecture, we created a two-dimensional array and we had to specify the number of rows and the number of columns ahead of time. We don't have to actually specify the number of columns when we first declare our two-dimensional array. We can do it when we instantiate each row. So every single row we can do our instantiation and determine how many elements is going to be in that particular row. So for example, let's say I create a two-dimensional array called board, and notice under the line for new int, I don't specify the number of columns. I still specify the number of rows. So this first line does let us create 3 rows, but we don't need to specify how many columns each row has just yet. We can do it for every single row that we create. So I do board 0 and I have new int 6. If I do board 1, I could do new int 2 and I can do new int 5. So the whole point is with this approach, I can have different numbers of columns for each row in my two-dimensional array. The reason we're allowed to do this is because a two-dimensional array is an array of arrays. It's technically a one-dimensional array, and each element is simply an array. So for each element, we can just decide when we instantiate what number of columns we have, or what number of elements that particular element is going to have. And there is a technical term for this. So arrays that have a different number of columns are called ragged arrays. Now, if we're going to process these arrays, we need to know the exact number of columns for every single row. So beforehand, we knew the number of columns for all the rows, but now for each row, I need to know the exact number of columns if I'm going to process all the elements correctly. So to do this, board.length will give us the number of rows. That's no issue. And board0.length will give us the number of columns for the first row. But that means that if I want to get the second row, I have to do board1.length and then board2.length and board3.length and so forth. But we would need to use the .length variable for that particular array if I want to get the number of columns. The next special case we'll take a look at is initializing two-dimensional arrays. So just like with one-dimensional arrays, we can initialize two-dimensional arrays when we declare them. It just looks a little bit different. So let me give you an example just to help clarify this. So here is our two-dimensional array. Here we're creating a two-dimensional integer array called board, and we're initializing it at the same time. So what's going on here? Well, each element is technically an array, which means that I need to initialize all the elements of that array. So here, the first line right here allows me to create a row where the first element is 2, the next element is 3, the next element is 1. And then I use a closing curly brace, and then I put a comma. My next element of the two-dimensional array is going to be another row. So here's all the elements for the second row. Here's all the elements for the third row. And here's all the elements for the fourth row. So this will create an array where we have four rows, and each row has 3 columns. But the whole point is I have my pair of curly braces, and then I have my semicolon at the end. Please do not forget this at the end. I have a pair of curly braces, and then for each element of the array, I would have another array in there that's separated by curly braces. So the whole point is if we want to initialize a two-dimensional array when declaring them, we make sure that the elements of each row are enclosed within the braces, and then we separate them with commas. And then all rows are enclosed within the braces. So just as we saw in the previous example. We can also initialize ragged arrays as well. So here's an example where I have my two-dimensional array. So my first row, which is right here, has 4 elements. So this creates an array of 4 elements for the first row. The second row, right here, only has 2 elements for its row. And then the third row is an array that has only 3 elements. So I'm allowed to do the same thing here for ragged arrays.